Thank you everyone for joining. This webinar will begin shortly. Before we do begin, we wanted to go through a few housekeeping items. One, we are recording this session and we will be sharing the slides after the presentation. We also want to make this interactive and we encourage you to share your questions and comments. We have a Q&A feature on the side of your screen. If you can please send your questions throughout the webinar, we'll be responding during the Q&A session. We also offer closed captioning and technical support. You see the links there on your screen. In addition, following the session, we would like to get your feedback. It helps us to provide and improve the webinars that we'll be doing in the future. Please take a few minutes to fill out the feedback form before you sign off for the day. With that, I'd like to welcome you to the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences Small Business Funding Early Stage Support to Commercialize Your Translational Science Innovation webinar. We will have a few featured speakers today. Lily Portilla, Director of Strategic Alliances of the Office of Strategic Alliances at NCATS. We'll also have Maria Thacker. She is CEO of Georgia Bio as well as Executive Director of the Georgia Bioed Institute. I would like to thank our partner, Georgia Bio, for being a part of this session today. And I would like to now turn it over to Maria Thacker for a few remarks.
Thank you so much. I will be brief. Georgia Bio is pleased to partner with NCATS to host this wonderful opportunity, and we're thrilled to have an outstanding group of people joining us for this very informative webinar. Thank you to our members that have chosen to join us today as well. Georgia Bio looks forward to continue offering these and other opportunities to grow our community, not only in Georgia, but in the Southeast. So please check our website out for future events. One housekeeping note, the slideshow will be made available on our website at gabio.org. That's GA for Georgia, bio.org under the resources tab shortly after the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the NCATS team, and thank you all again. We're pleased to partner on this event.
Thank you, Maria. And now joining me is Lily, and she'll be leading our presentation.
Hi, this is Lily Portilla from the NCATS Office of Strategic Alliances, and I will go ahead and start off with the webinar. And I want to thank again our partners at Georgia Bio for opening up this opportunity for us. And at the end of the presentation, there's contact information in case you need to reach me, ask a question, and as Monique stated, we very much value your feedback and hope if you have any comments about the webinar and the information provided that you will give us your comments on that. So the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, NCATS, is one of the 27 institutes at the National Institutes of Health. We conduct research around the operation of how translation and the idea here is how these translational bottlenecks can be addressed to get treatments to patients more quickly. And we focus on what's common across various diseases and the translational process. NCATS, unlike some of the other NIH institutes, is not a disease-specific institute, but we are disease agnostic. However, I will say that we do have a great interest in rare diseases, and I will be highlighting a program at the end of the presentation that touches upon that particular program that we have here at NCATS that is available for academics and small businesses. And next slide, please. So there are other programs, too, that NCATS manages and funds. One of those is the Clinical Translational Science Award Program, which is about 62 academic medical centers that are funded by this particular network, and they provide clinical support to these academic universities. I believe there's actually one that is situated at Emory University that we fund. We also have the Rare Disease Clinical Network, The new Therapeutic Uses Program, which is our program where we try to pair up investigators with shelved assets that pharma has that have failed for a particular indication, but then to repurpose them for other indications since they're rich with clinical information and hopefully addressing a new use for that particular asset. And their applications are available every year under that particular program. We also have the National Chemical Genomics Center here that does a lot of high throughput screening. The next two programs, Therapeutic for Rare Neglected Diseases program, the TRND program, and the Bridges program are ones that I'm going to be talking about as part of this presentation. And we also have other initiatives here that we run out of the center. Next slide. So again, NCATS, being one of the 27 institutes here at the NIH, participates in the SBIR STTR program. We have several areas of research priorities that we want to cover under the program. If you go to our website, you can, and at the very end of this particular slide deck, you will see specifically the types of topics that we are looking for, but they fit into three buckets, which are preclinical drug discovery development tools and technologies, biomedical and clinical health research informatics tools, and also clinical dissemination and implementation research tools and technologies that we fund under the program. The SBIR STTR program at the NIH has 3 submission dates every year. They are, for 2020, we just had one that passed in January. The next one is coming up on April 6th, and the one after that is April 7th. Next slide. So there are various funding opportunities under the NIH SBIR STTR program. The majority of the applications that come to the NIH come under what's called the omnibus solicitation. The omnibus solicitation covers all topics of interest across the 24 participating institutes here at the NIH, as well as our sister agencies of the CDC and FDA. And again, those standard deadlines are April 5th, September 5th, and January 5th. That's what they are every year, and 3 submission dates. Then there are also targeted grant solicitations that we have on various research priorities. And you can see, if you go to the NIH website, you'll be able to see those particular specific targeted solicitations. NCATS has a few, but if there's a priority that we want to highlight, we may do, again, one of these targeted solicitations. And the due dates typically track the omnibus solicitation standard deadlines, but with that said, some of them have different deadlines, so it's always good to check out what that particular funding announcement states. And then once a year, there is a contract solicitation for the SBIR program, and these are topics that the NIH deems to be high priority, and we use a contracting mechanism because we expect there to be a deliverable at the end of the day with these contract topics, and that is those contract topics usually close in the October-November timeframe. Next slide. So at the NIH, SBIR is one of the largest sources of early stage financing, and the budget for the program tracks with the agency's R&D budget. At the NIH, that's $1.15 billion that is set aside specifically for small businesses across all of the NIH centers. And it's a significant amount of money that every year must be designated and provided to small businesses under the SBIR STTR program. Next slide. So when I said that the budget tracks with the agency's R&D budget. So Congress has said that there's a percentage set aside that we must do for this. So it's 3.2% for the SBIR program, and it is 0.45 for the STTR program. So as you can see, the majority and lion's share of the budget for the small business initiatives fall under SBIR. That's not to say that we are still not looking for good STTR applications, but it's good to see the differences in terms of what the set-asides of these budgets look like. Next slide. So the benefits of the program there's multiple benefits. One is, as I said, this tracks with the agency's budget, and it's a congressionally mandated program, which means that we have to set the money aside, so it's pretty stable and predictable. The other reason is that it's non-dilutive. We, the government, does not ask for IP rights back after funding. We recognize that the IP belongs to the small business or the academic that is participating in the program. And once you're into the program, you can get access to other technical assistance and commercialization programs that the NIH offers to its SBIR and STTR awardees. And I'll briefly touch on those towards the end of the presentation. But another reason that it's important too is that your project undergoes rigorous scientific peer review process here at the NIH. We know that many of our awardees will use that peer review and the summary statement of the review as a way of leveraging and trying to attract more dollars for their companies, because they are able to say that the science has been validated by the NIH. Next slide. So it is a 3-phase program, and when I say phase 1, I want to make sure that everyone understands that I'm not referring to clinical phases here. It's just that that's the various phases of this particular program. Phase 1, SBIR, STTR, is typically what we classify as feasibility studies, and the budget guideline here at the NIH is $225K for a phase 1 SBIR STTR grant. Project period can last anywhere between 6 months to a year. But with that said, about the budget, there are projects that the NIH believes that there should be higher dollar amounts associated with them. So there are at NCATS we have several topics that we deem to be that fall under this category, and you're able to get a waiver and apply up to $325,000 for a phase 1. Phase 2 is more full R&D research. The NIH budget cap is $1.5 million. Projects run anywhere between 2 to 3 years, depending on what you're doing. And there is when we refer to something called a fast track application, that's when applicants apply not only for the phase 1, but the phase 2. And typically the types of projects that apply for that are ones that have some preliminary data, so they're able to make a really compelling case as to why NIH should not only fund the phase 1, but the phase 2. And then there are some instances where applicants feel that, I have that feasibility data already, and I would like to skip the phase 1 and go directly to the phase 2, and that's the direct to phase 2 program that we also participate in. Some institutes, and that includes the NCATS, have a phase 2B program, and that's additional funding that you can request for a project. For example, there's additional regulatory studies that need to happen to get to an IND filing, or you're developing a device and there's some complex instrumentation that needs to happen. We could also consider funding what's called this phase 2B program. At our institute, you could request up to $1 million per year, but the caveat is that we must have funded the phase 2 in order for you to be considered for the phase 2B award. And phase 3 is what we typically hear considered to be commercialization or, you know, a graduation from this particular program, and recognizing that NIH generally is not going to be a customer to anything that you're developing, again, because this is considered to be seed funding, early stage seed funding to kind of get your project going, and for you to leverage that funding with other sources and strategic partnerships that you could develop. Next slide. So who is eligible for SBIR? And these, the eligibility criteria, keep in mind, is not something that the NIH dictates. It's something that the small business, the U.S. Small Business Administration, they put the parameters around what makes someone eligible to receive SBIR or STTR funding. So a SBIR eligible company would be one that has 500 or fewer employees. The PI's primary employment has to be with the small business at the time of award and during the entire duration of the project. The company can be more than 50% U.S. owned by individuals or independently operated, or more than 50% owned and controlled by other other business concerns that are that are greater than 50% owned and controlled by one or more individuals, or your company can also participate in the SBIR program if you have multiple venture capital investment and ownership into your company that's no more than 50%. Next slide. For STTR, it's a little different. Here, you have to be collaborating with a nonprofit research institution or U.S. college or university, or what's called a federally funded R&D center, an FFRDC. And 40% of the work must be done by the small business, and a minimum of 30% must be done by that research institution. If you need IP rights, for example, let's say that you want to partner with a faculty at a particular university, that faculty has developed a intellectual property that you would like to use as part of your small business. At the time of award, you're going to have to demonstrate to us that you either have a license or some kind of option that allows you to use those intellectual property rights as part of the company. And here, unlike the SBIR, the primary employment of the principal investigator can be either with the small business or with the research institution. Next slide. So here is a recap of the differences between the two programs, SBIR and STTR. As I said, the PI with an SBIR has to be with the company. With the STTR, the PI can be working for the research institution or for the company. But keep in mind that the award is always made to the small business. If you're partnering with a research institution, you can sub-award to them, but NIH will always make the award to that small business. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about the omnibus solicitation, which again is the bulk of this is the funding announcement that most of the applications to the NIH come in under. These are the two solicitations that are currently open for the SBIR and STTR. If you go to these solicitations, there's a hot link to what's called the program descriptions and research topics. If you click on that document, it's a very, it's several hundred pages, but you will be able to see across the NIH and our sister agencies exactly what topics we fund here at the NIH and what we consider to be priorities for our respective institutes and centers. And I did talk about the standard deadlines. Next slide. So next couple of slides are some specific funding announcements that NCATS is participating in. Here is one of them. It's related to the Illuminating the Druggable Genome initiative that the NIH has. Several NIH institutes participate here, and if you are interested in learning more about what is covered under the Illuminating the IDG program, I encourage you to look at this particular funding announcement that we have open for SBIR and STTR. And the next deadline for that is April 6th. Next slide, please. The other funding opportunities that we have, once you receive an NIH grant, you can also ask for administrative supplements. This is one that we have specifically to promote diversity in research and development in small businesses. We will, if you have, for instance, a particular student that falls within the criteria of the type of individual that we would fund under this diversity supplement, we will fund their salary for the duration of for a couple of years. And the idea here is that these individuals get to learn what it is to run a small business, but they're also there to provide scientific support to the particular program that you have in your small business. Also, under the NIH HEAL initiative, that's the initiative that NIH currently has to deal with the opioid crisis. There are 2 open requests for applications. This is specific money that has been set aside for small businesses to respond to this particular crisis. And the next application deadline is April 9th, and you'll notice that it's different than the April 6th deadline that I've been talking about, and that's why it's really important to look at these individual funding announcements to see when applications are due. And also, if you have NIH funding or had NIH funding in the last several years, you could also apply for what's the Commercial Readiness Pilot Program, which is technical assistance that we would fund under this. For example, let's say that you wanted to get a market analysis done on your specific technology or a patent landscape done. Those are things that typically NIH does not fund under a regular SBIR, STTR grant, but this particular program or funding announcement does allow us to fund that type of work. And as I said, you could have been an NIH awardee in the last 2 years, or you can be a current awardee and apply for this program. And the next deadline for that is April 6th. Next slide. So how long does it take to get an award? Both these programs are not things that I would consider to be, quick turnaround times. The time period can be between the time of submission of an award to submission of an application to the time you get an award can be anywhere between 6 or 9 months. For example, if you're going to be applying to the next April 5th deadline, you would submit then, and then the applications typically get reviewed in June, July timeframe. We will have our scores by then, and then our respective institute advisory councils will look at those applications and provide their concurrence for an approval for funding the application. So the earliest award date that we would be making would be late August, early September, depending on for example, if the money's been spent down, we may have to actually consider funding into the next fiscal year. But those are all things that you can talk to me or another NIH program officer about in terms of the timing for this, the timing for the award, depending on the due date, on the application date that you submit to. But as you can see, it's not something that we turn around in several months. There are several, as I said, 7 to 9 months time between the time you submit and the time you could possibly get an award. Next slide. Okay, so next couple of slides are going to be around developing a successful application. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm I apologize for the lag there in the slides coming up. So if you've applied to the NIH before, you will see that some of these review criteria look very familiar, and they are, except that there's an additional one here around commercialization, which is, again, the focus of this particular program. But when we look at significance and the approach you're taking, I think NIH Review wants to know that what you're developing here actually has commercial potential and what your potential market could be for the product. Are you a first-in-class product, or is it a first-in-class therapeutic that you're developing or device, or is it something that is an improvement on what currently is in the market? So these are the kinds of, that's the kind of focus that these applications have, as opposed to, if you're familiar with NIH funding, with what an R01 grant would look like. So again, SBIR and STTR grants really have a focus around commercialization, so we want to understand who it is, what your project is, market potential, and how this grant will help you move the project to the point where you can leverage and potentially develop strategic partnerships or attract additional investment in your company. One of the other things, too, is some of the questions that we get is, well, I'm a virtual company. Can I apply for NIH, SBIR, STTR funding? And my response to you is, well, it depends. If you are a virtual company and you're doing maybe IT work, something that you could do that you don't need a lab or something like that, there may be some flexibility in that, and I think every case is unique, and we would have to talk to you about what you're going to be doing. But remember, there is an expectation that a certain amount of the work must be done by the small business. So we are going to make sure that if you are contemplating on doing wet lab work, that you have access to a wet lab, whether it be through an arrangement that you have with the university, with the bioincubator, or you actually have wet lab space in your company. This issue of virtual companies is one that we deal with frequently, and my best advice is to talk to your program officer about what NIH can and will fund. Next slide. So the SBIR STTR submission is done electronically. Before you submit your application, there are 5 important registrations that need to be done before you can submit, and they need to be done in this particular order. You have to have a DUNS number, and if you ever want to get any kind of payment from the government, you have to be registered in what's called the System of Award Management. In that, that registration can take up to 4 to 6 weeks, because that system is checking with, for instance, an EIN number, a tax ID number, to make sure that your company has a tax ID number registered with the IRS. So these things take a while to do, and I can't stress that enough, that if you are going to be applying or thinking about applying, work on these registrations early, because you will not be able to submit your application until these registrations are completed. Next slide. There are also special designations. The NIH and also the Small Business Administration that oversees the overall SBIR STTR initiative wants to know about economically disadvantaged small businesses and women-owned small businesses that are applying to the program. There are certain criteria that would distinguish one from being socially an economically disadvantaged small business. Again, SBA makes these criteria, and what we consider to be a woman-owned small business. If you meet these criteria, the NIH very much would appreciate that you would self-designate, make that designation on the application, so we can track who is applying to the program. And also, this helps us do outreach to these particular groups as well, too. Next slide. So here are some top tips in applying to the program. I've mentioned this before. It's really important for you to review that funding announcement, really understand, first of all, are you eligible, what the special criteria are, the types of applications that we are looking for, and making sure that your project aligns with what those areas of interest are under the funding announcement. NIH has a couple of successful applications on the website. It's made publicly. If you want to see what does a successful application look like, you can go to that website and pull those applications up. We have samples of phase 1 and phase 2 SBIR and STTR applications there. I encourage you to talk to an NIH program officer before you submit to make sure that the application is a good fit for that institute. But, you know, by talking to program officers, you also find out about what those research priorities may be for that particular center. And NIH is a very big place, and me personally, I can't claim to know everything and every priority going on across the NIH, but that's why talking to individual program officers will provide you with more information. Register early. And as I said, if you're going to submit to the program, you need to have those registrations done. If you're a first-time NIH submitter, there is a application tool called the NIH Assist that allows you, that annotates the application and helps you understand what it is that we're looking for in the application. And a lot of our first-time applicants use the NIH Assist to help them out. Also, if you are talking to an institute, for instance, NCATS, and I say to you, hey, you know, I think your application perfectly fits fine with us, and I encourage you to list us as the primary assignment on your application, you can specify that in the application. You can also specify the study section that you think your application should be reviewed by. These are suggestions that you make, and many times they will be honored. Sometimes the folks that make these determinations feel that other study sections may be more appropriate, but you certainly have that opportunity to designate the appropriate institute and study section that you think your application should be assigned to. And again, submit early and not hours or minutes before the application deadline. Many times, this happens every time without fail, there are a couple of emails I get at 5:01 p.m. Eastern Standard Time from people who had submitted an application and ran into an error, who are now unfortunately precluded from submitting the application. So submitting early is a great way of making sure that you're not going to run into any errors, deal with any error messages or pagination problems with your application very last minute. So please submit early. Next slide. And here are some common application problems that we have collected with the assistance of the folks that run the review for the applications. And as you can see, they kind of run the gamut here in terms of, not making a very good or compelling case about the commercial potential and the impact that your technology is going to have on patients, sometimes lack of innovation. Applicants want to show they can do everything, and by doing that, the application also becomes very diffused and unfocused, and the reviewers will pick that up and say that it's a big risk for NIH to fund something that is so all over the place, so they will not fund that. And proposing a large amount of work for the budgets that correspond to the phase 1 and phase 2. And it's really important as well, too, to understand who your competition is, because the reviewers, they will know that, and they will point that out, that maybe you did not do a good job of explaining how your product differentiates itself from a competitor. So these are some of those application problems that we see on a pretty consistent basis. Okay, next slide. So, important facts to remember before submitting: that eligibility is determined at the time of award. For example, we will do these rechecks with you to make sure that you're eligible to receive the application, and certainly at the time of award that is going to be done. If your PI, principal investigator in the application, is not required to have an MD or PhD when you apply to the NIH. However, we are expecting you to have the right team assembled to get the specific aims of the grant done. So if you are working in a specific clinical area and do not have a proper clinician that can, as a consultant or providing advice on your project, review will pick that up and say that you did not have the adequate team assembled. So we want to make sure that you have the right people on your team to get those specific aims addressed. You can submit applications to different agencies for similar work. However, just keep in mind that if you're doing that, we are able to check and see if you're being funded by other agencies. What we want to make sure is that NIH isn't duplicating efforts in terms of what it's funding. So if there are applications that you have in other agencies that are pending that are look to be in the same area, we will look at those to determine whether there's overlap, and if there is, we will come back to you and tell you why we may not be able to fund the application. So please keep that in mind that we're the government. We know what other people are doing. So in this airspace. Okay, next slide. So yes, sometimes your application will not get reviewed. 50% of the applications that get submitted to the NIH will not get a score. But with that said, they still get a summary statement and a review. The reviewers will provide feedback on the application, and we encourage that you use that summary statement, even though if you may have not gotten a score or maybe your score was not did not get funded by that particular NIH institute. We encourage you to use that summary statement as your roadmap to improving the application. Very much so. If you don't get funded the first time, please resubmit, as your chances will increase. And if you want to understand what the review process and the dynamics of review look like, the Center for Scientific Review, here's a link to their website, and you can look and see what a study section does, how study sections review applications. And I talked about the fact that you could also designate what study section you want your application to go to. You can do that and see exactly what those study sections are, and even the roster of reviewers on the CSR website that we have listed here. Next slide. Okay, so very quickly, wanted to talk about the types of applications that we fund. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. We have an initiative around tissue chips and using those tissue chips as a way of testing drugs as opposed to testing them directly on animals, because we know that sometimes animal data doesn't necessarily translate to humans and how they react to drugs. So we have developed this tissue chip program, and AxoSem is a small business out of Louisiana who applied to the program and has been able to leverage their grant that they received with us to receive additional funding. The company's been able to acquire other funding, and they were also a company that we were able to through this program that the NIH has, support to go to a conference, to a venture capital conference, and do a pitch contest, and they were able to talk about their technology and try to secure some additional partnerships as well. So that's an example of something that we funded and very much of a success story. Next slide, please. The next slide, the next company is Therapeutics out of Cambridge, which is a novel drug delivery technology. It's a pill that expands and then stays in the gut for a longer period of time. We funded a specific project around using ivermectin delivering it through this pill and for malaria, and the company has been able to leverage this grant that it got from NCATS to figure out how to manufacture the drug, and the company now has been able to raise additional funds as well too, and it's a great example of how they were able to leverage what they did here with this grant and again develop strategic partnerships and expand this platform drug delivery system to other applications as well too. Next slide. So again, if you want to talk to me, I encourage you to reach me. Here's our email, FAQs also online if you want to look at those, and then our current funding opportunities can be found on this link. Next slide. So I did talk to you about a couple of other resources that the NIH has for existing applicants. So once you get an award, there's other opportunities for you to apply to certain programs and initiatives that we have here for SBIR companies. This is one of them. It's the I-Corps program. I-Corps teaches our SBIR companies how to do customer discovery, allows them to pivot and perhaps submit a better phase 2 when they're ready to do so. We will pay for the team, the company, to go through the training, and it's a supplement that we provide under the grant. Next slide. There's also a couple of technical assistance programs that we have. There's a niche assessment that does a market analysis and determines what your competitive advantage is. It's a report that it can provide to you. We use contractors to help us with that, but that's an offering that we give our small business awardees. And also the Commercial Accelerator Program, the CAP program, which helps you with how to do pitch coaching, also facilitates investor partnerships, how to deal with regulatory issues, and those are, it's a training that we offer them. And again, you apply for the program and we pay for you to go through the program. Next slide. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about a couple of other resources that we have here at NCATS. And these resources are offered through the NCATS Therapeutic Development branch. This particular branch offers different ways of collaborating. They are able to offer some of these services and opportunities to collaborate around medchem, if you need some kind of tox study done, GMP manufacturing, particular kind of formulations for your therapeutic that you're working on. So a menu of the different things that they offer. And the idea here is to kind of get you across that valley of death that many of our applicants face, that they've gotten funding, but now they're kind of stuck because they need very specific things. And those very specific things are typically not things that NIH would fund under an SBIR STTR. So you could leverage your grant with these particular offerings that the Therapeutics Development Branch offers. And specifically, next slide, there is the Bridges program. And here you identify when you have a clinic, you enter when you have a clinical candidate identified. Any disease is eligible to participate in the program. The idea here is to do a gap analysis and determine what you need in order to get to an IND filing. They work with various modalities, small molecule, large molecule gene therapy, and it's open to academic as well as SBIR eligible companies. Next slide. And this is on the website. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I just want to give you a sense of the types of projects that we have funded. As you can see, some of these are small businesses, but we've been pretty successful at getting our collaborations under this program to an IND filing. Next slide. The next program is the TRND program. Now here, you must be working in either an FDA orphan designated disease or a disease that the WHO meets the WHO neglected tropical disease criteria. We can actually take you past an IND filing under this program. Again, very small. A gap analysis is done. We work closely with you. If you need certain kinds of studies done, we can partner with our CROs that we have working with us to get that data to you so that you can get to a key inflection point like an IND filing. We work with academics and small businesses, pretty much work with everyone under this program. So the next slide, I believe, these are the different TRND programs and the folks that we have been collaborating with, and basically how far we took when these programs came in. Some of them have come in the lead op stage, others, we helped out with IND enabling studies, you can get a sense of how we've been working with these companies here. Next slide. So here's a quick example of an applicant that developed a new molecular entity, a new compound for a rare disease, and she had cobbled together R01 and STTR funding that added up to about $3.5 million. And she was doing well, and then she had a pre-IND meeting with the FDA and determined that she needed to get these 2 tox studies done in order to file her IND. And the tox studies totaled about, it was I believe a rat and a dog study that totaled about $500,000, which would be very difficult on its own to get that type of funding at the NIH. So she applied to the Bridges program. We talked to her, again, did that gap analysis, determined that yes, indeed, we could help her with providing access to our CROs and providing her with that data she needed in order to file the successful IND. And as a result of that, she raised, after filing the IND, she was able to raise $50 million in VC Series A funding. So both these programs do not give you money, but they give you access to resources and expertise that we have here at the NCATS. And submission, next slide. If you want to apply to any of those programs, please go to the website because they're on a rolling submission basis. And if you have any questions, of course, you can talk to me. And with that kind of concludes my talk. And here are all the different ways that you can engage with NCATS. And I hope you sign up for our newsletter, Twitter, and stay in touch with us and hear about new funding opportunities out there. So that's it.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you to all our participants. We have been receiving your questions. If you do have other questions to share, please use the Q&A feature. It will either show up on the right-hand side or bottom of your screen. And with that, I'm going to start with the questions we've received so far. So, Lily, there are some folks who would like us to help understand what a PI is, just to explain that a bit more, and I have a follow-up question on that.
So the PI is going to be the primary point of contact for the grant, the principal investigator, who would be in charge of making sure that the specific aims are being addressed, kind of leading the team that's assembled, whether that team be other employees or consultants that are needed in order to get the project done. And it's pretty much the point of contact for the grant. So, for example, if I have questions, I'm going to be talking to that principal investigator about the progress that the grant is making.
Thank you, Lily. And we have some academic researchers who are in the different phases of spinning out companies. So this question applies to that scenario. So we have a PI who's in the process of developing a therapeutic targeting mechanism of action for a particular disease. And this person wants to create a startup around this so they can apply for an SBIR. The question is, does he or she have to be the PI on the SBIR application, or can anyone that wants to own the company and use the therapeutic be the PI on the application?
Sure. Yes, I mean, there's a couple of ways that could work out. For example, if you had a student in your lab who wants to maybe work in being, would like to be more entrepreneurial in what they do, they could be the one that is the PI for the company. Or, you know, you could also arrange to do an STTR where you're working with a small business and find a way of licensing that invention to the small business for them to work on it, and you can stay engaged but not necessarily be the person running the company or the PI on the grant.
Thank you, Lily. And then to follow that thread, one other question we just received. So if the PI is 100% dedicated to the research in a public university that is a 25% owner of the small business, should that person apply for an STTR or an SBIR? And one other note, the CEO of the small business is 100% dedicated to the small business.
I mean, under an STTR, the academic absolutely could be a PI on the grant, but again, the funding is definitely going to always go to the small business. And they would be required to do a percentage of the work on a certain percentage of the specific game. So, you know, absolutely there is a way to stay engaged and not be the PI of the company, but you can definitely stay engaged in collaborating with the small business. You know, with that said, if that academic also wants to be involved in an SBIR, that's absolutely possible as a key personnel, and also you are allowed to have multiple PIs under an SBIR grant, so you may not be the principal PI of the small business, but you could be, you know, like a co-PI that's working closely with the small business as well.
Thank you.
Monique, let me just add that these kinds of questions are great questions that you can ask me as a program officer or somebody else at the NIH that works in the program, so that we can kind of, you know, brainstorm with you about the different ways that this could work.
Thank you. I am going to move to a couple questions about the phases of application. So, can I apply to NCATS Phase 2 if I have received a Phase 1 from another institute?
You can, and with that said, I want to make sure that it was a good fit for NCATS. So having a discussion with me ahead of time to make that and to help make that determination would be good. You know, there are situations where we may feel that you're staying at that particular institute is a better fit than coming to NCATS. You know, I know I said that we were a disease agnostic institute, but if you're squarely working in oncology and, you know, working on prostate cancer, I think that the National Cancer Institute is going to be a much better fit for your application than NCATS is. And the other point that I don't believe we addressed during the presentation, Monique, was NCATS is made the decision that it is not going to fund clinical trials under the SBIR STTR program. Happy to fund preclinical work, and we can fund clinical research as long as it does not meet the definition of what the FDA considers to be a clinical trial. Now, some of the other disease-specific institutes will definitely be funding clinical trials under their programs, and that's another reason why talking to different institutes about your project will help determine which one is a good fit for what you're doing.
Great. And along those lines of phases, so I've got some questions about fast track. Does NCATS offer fast track and direct to phase 2? And when is it appropriate to apply?
Yes to both. We do fund both mechanisms. Fast tracks, you know, I think success rates for fast tracks versus just submitting a phase 1 are pretty equal these days. My advice always is, if you are going to be applying for a fast track, if you have some preliminary data, to me it's important to include that, again, to demonstrate to the reviewers that, you know, it is a good risk for the NIH to consider funding not only the phase 1 or phase 2 project of what you have, of what you're proposing under the grant. Under the direct to phase 2, you're going to have to really, you would basically be able to skip that phase 1, and that's demonstrating that you already have that data, and that you were able to get that data through another source that was not the NIH SBIR STTR program. So here you're going to have to definitely demonstrate that you've got that feasibility data in place, and that's what makes you eligible to apply to the direct to phase 2 program.
Thank you, Lily. And I just wanted to call attention, the feedback form link is on your chat, and want to really encourage everyone to please fill that out as we're going through some of these questions. So the other question we've received is, what's the best way for a company to know when it's right to apply to NCATS versus some of the other institutes?
I talked about this I think it was one of the slides that had the omnibus solicitation on it, the 2 links to that. You can go to the omnibus solicitation. There is a link to the program description guide, and you can open that up. Applicants will open that document up and basically search via topically to see what institutes are funding, have interest in what they're funding. So that's one way of determining who potentially to talk to. Another thing that you can do is use the NIH Reporter tool, and that's a public database that's available, searchable, and tells you pretty much everything that the NIH has funded. So you could do a search by topic and see what other institutes are funding similar types of research. And that's another great way for you to determine, you know, what your competition is at the NIH, you know, what else is being funded in your area. And all that information is publicly available through the NIH Reporter tool.
Thank you, Lily. And I wanted to also just note that NCATS really does make itself available to folks who want to talk about their research topics idea before submitting an application. So Lily and her team are accessible, and we did include a note about the email and also chatted out that email. We'll send a follow-up to you all with it as well. Also wanted to note that we will also send you a link to the research topics, which is also on the website. That'll also help you see if the research you're thinking about aligns with what NCATS funds. A couple of questions about the resource programs that NCATS and the NIH offer. So I'm going to put 2 questions into one here. Do you need to be awarded an SBIR grant to be eligible for the NIH I-Corps? And what other opportunities that may be available to non-SBIR grantees does the NCATS offer?
So who is the eligibility for I-Corps? You have to have an active phase 1 SBIR or STTR grant, or even an active NIH SBIR contract. You can apply to the program via but you have to have those mechanisms, and you're open, and your grant has to be active during the entire time you're participating in the I-Corps program. And I believe the supplement is $55,000 that we will give your team for registration of the program, and also travel to cover your travel as well, and extra money to do market analysis or whatever it is that you need in order to meet the goals of the programs. But you have to have an active phase 1 grant in place. And okay, Monique, what was the second question? Sorry about that. What was the?
It was just one example would be, would Bridges and Trends or any of the other programs across companies across the Valley of Death be open to non-SBIR awardees?
Right. Thank you. Yes. So Bridges and Trend are one of those two of those programs that you don't need an SBIR to participate in. That's open to everyone. The National Cancer Institute has the next program, which runs very similarly to Trend and Bridges. But there you have to be clearly working in the oncology space in order to be eligible for that one. Also, there's the NeuroNext program, and that program, it's based out of the Neurology Institute, and you need to be working in, it's pretty broad, some neurodegenerative disease, neurology issues, brain issues. Those are all programs that support applicants, and you don't necessarily have to have an SBIR, and there's they're de-risking programs and certainly worthwhile looking into.
Thank you. We have 4 more questions which we'll allow. I just wanted to know, I know that we're at the top of the hour, but there's some good questions we want to get to. I also just wanted to note that in your chat feature, we have included a link to a webinar that the NCATS is leading with the U.S. Patent and Trade Office that will also provide some information on how to protect your IP. So that's a very important webinar that's coming up on the 29th of this month. With that, Lily, I have another question about these resource programs. So if someone has participated in the CAP program in the past, would they be able to participate in the Commercialization Assistance Program or the Niche Assessment Program in the future?
If it's for a different project. If it's for the same project, I think that might be the restriction. But if you're working in a different area, a different project than what you originally applied under CAP or Niche, I think that would be okay.
Okay, thank you. This next question relates to eligibility, and I wanted to note that I did link to eligibility in the chat box. This is specifically about U.S. companies that may have some ownership in other places. So the question is, do the U.S. companies with foreign investments up to 25% of the ownership qualify for SBIR funding?
You know what? I think that would be a great discussion to have offline. So I could provide you guidance with that. And I should have mentioned this. A lot of the eligibility issues we're going to defer to our colleagues at the Small Business Administration because, again, they're the ones that define what eligibility for the program is. So that may be one where we need to work with the SBA to get clearance on that one. So.
Perfect. And I know that there are a couple questions about Trends and Bridges, and I wanted to note that on our site we have a link with eligibility and how to apply to those, so please do check that out. There is a question about the typical funding rate and what percentage of applications typically get funded.
So if you go to the NIH website, you'll be able to get all the different funding success rates for both the programs. For NCATS, we pretty much track with what the NIH does. So, for example, for phase 1 grants, I think the success rate is 21%, and ours is pretty close. And for the phase 2, I think it's something like in the high 30s or 40s, and I think we are close to that as well.
Thank you. And then the last question, how do we know about the contracts in 3D tissue-based precision medicine or rare disease drug development?
About contracts in those areas? Okay, so just very quickly, contract topics are submitted, it's a special solicitation that's put out in the street around the July-August timeframe, and applications are due to the NIH October, November. Those same topics can also be are available under the grant topics. So if you want to submit a grant, you can also submit at those 3 submission dates that I talked about. But if there was a specific contract topic, those are once a year, and that solicitation typically comes out over between mid to late summer. And if you have any questions, send me an email, about that.
Thank you, Lily. And thank you to Georgia Bio. Thank you to all of our participants who are here today. I know that there may be some more questions that will come through. Please do email us. We would be happy to do that. And if there are any unanswered questions that we have, we will funnel those over to NCATS. Thank you for your time. Please take a look at the feedback form we've sent, as well as the NCATS SBIR website. Have a wonderful afternoon. This concludes our presentation.